G'day expats and welcome to another episode of Expat Chat, episode 91 today, cracking on into the almost to the 100. Joined today by my mate and colleague, James Ridley, who's the Managing Director for the Gold Coast office of the Australia. G'day, James.
G'day, Brett. And those that are tuning in today, as always, join with my co-host, Brett Evans, Managing Director for the EMEA region. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, you'll notice that Brett's had an attempt at growing a beard, and it's rather impressive. And it looks like it's a strong beard. It's well past the 5 p.m. shadow, and it looks like he's actually that's right, you've got that little cut above your eyebrow as well. Not cut, it's got stitches in it.
That's right. That's right. Headbutting things, and then I should be headbutting. So and it's a bit scary how much grey's in the beard. So I'm going to have to consider the long-term ramifications of my aging effect with that beard. So but anyway, it was nice to have a break. Obviously, thanks to you and Mitch for holding the fort while I was away and keeping the punters informed. Mate, today we're going to have a talk about a pretty big topic, and that's an update on the latest developments with the proposed changes to tax residency. But mate, before we get into there, let's quickly tick the compliance box by running through our disclaimer. All the information that we're going to talk about today should be treated as informational and educational purposes only. If you need personal advice, please speak to a professional like Atlas.
That's exactly right. And today we're talking about a really important topic. It's come up in the media, and I suppose really important news for expats. And what we're going to deep dive into once more again is the tax residency rules and what has been proposed in the past to modernise our tax residency rules. And only in, I suppose, the last week or so, it's popped back up again. They've opened it up for consultation. So we're going to just review a little bit, and I guess as a bit of a refresh, go into what the general changes are. And then also, what does it actually mean when they put this through a consultation process with an end date, and what are the next steps after that? I know I've had a lot of clients ask me, where's this going to land? And it's really bizarre because remember, Brett, we got that update where they finalised guidance, what seems like only a couple of months ago. It was only a couple of months ago on the residency rules.
June.
And that's exactly right. And that was aligning it to the old residency rules, giving us all these helpful examples. And now 2 months later, they come out and say, hang on, we're putting the new rules that we proposed a couple of years ago. Felt like a couple of years ago. I think COVID's caused a bit of a blip, hasn't it? A blur.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hey, let's put this under consultation because we do want to move ahead with this at some point. So that's what I want to talk about today.
Yeah, and let's get the folks out there a bit of chronology for those who are sort of new to the topic or new to Atlas and the podcast. 2017 to 2019, Board of Taxation was asked by the federal government and the ATO to re-look at the tax residency laws. They were built back in 1936. So just to put some, I guess, context into that, that was back in the days when we used to put our clothes into a trunk and jump on a steamer ship to go overseas. So a lot has changed since the last iteration of residency. 2019, Board of Taxation presented to Canberra their recommendations with respect to how they think a modern tax residency legislation would work. Fast forward, obviously COVID, sort of Canberra had their hands full. And then in 2021, we saw Scotty from marketing bring out, quite a concerted effort to look at putting this legislation through. 2022, obviously Scotty got kicked out. Labor came in, and then obviously this year, in the budget this year, we didn't see any conversations. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. But for those folks who, do actually listen to every episode, and I've actually met a few this week, so there's more than just my mum and dad, which is great.
That is good.
Yeah, it is good. It is good. Though might remember in previous episodes we did say, and also in articles online, just because they didn't mention it in the budget this year doesn't mean it wasn't going to come up. But we didn't expect it to turn around so quickly after the ATO updated their tax ruling. So
no. Yeah. And I mean, wholeheartedly, I'll admit, usually when they finalise guidance on something that important, this isn't usually revisited, for a few financial years at least. So the fact that they've put this up for consultation means, hang on, they do want to get serious about this. They do want to move to a change, move away from the 1936 grey rules, I guess you could call them, get something that's more objective. So it's really interesting that I honestly didn't think we'd see them raise this again until maybe 2025, 2026. And I think it's caught a lot of accountants that deal with expats off guard, and they're going, shit, okay, they are going to get serious with this. Let's submit a really good comprehensive submission again, like what we did with our bill in the past. We got plenty of signatures on that. And obviously now we're going to have to go through the same process, and let's see if they hear us.
Let's. I'll actually read verbatim what, because it's funny how this document that came out, the consultation paper request, came out. I'll tell you the date it was. Now, not being a conspiracy theorist at all, but they actually don't put a date on when they ask for consultations, but they do say from the 21st of July to the 22nd of September. So call it, within the last week or so. And then just so happens that on the 27th of July, I received an email from the Petitions Committee in Canberra that says, a quote, "I'm writing in regard to petition EN 4259, for which you are the principal petitioner. As you know, your petition was presented to the House of Reps on the 7th of November and referred to the Treasurer. Unfortunately, due to a technical error, inverted commas," I'm putting the inverted commas in. So for those folks out there who are listening, not watching, it's the old fingers, it's the rabbit ears. "The email referring your petition was not received by the Minister's Office on the date it was sent. We apologise for the delay. This has caused you in receiving a response. I can confirm that the correspondence referring your petition has now been received by the Minister's Office. When a response is provided, will be presented in the House and published on the website." So whether they've done that, because they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't want to respond, because normally they respond within 30 to 60 days of a federal government petition.
That's right.
Now they've got a bit of an idea, okay, we're going ahead with this. This is going to become part of policy. And whether they reset that 30, 60 days. And I dare say, the Treasury's going to come back saying, "Oh, thank you very much for your petition. We've actually just released the consultation paper." Anyway, conspiracy theorists, tin hats, chemtrails, what do you want to call it? We'll see what happens there. But, mate, let's jump into what the rules are in a very abridged version. We've covered it ad nauseum, but it's always good to refresh. And then we'll jump into what the consultation paper is and the next steps from there.
That's right, mate. Well, I think the main thing that we enjoyed seeing coming out of it was trying to establish this simple bright line test as the primary test to decide whether you're an Australian tax resident. So the introduction of the 183-day rule being the primary test now, that was sort of, that's the primary test. And then if you haven't been in Australia for more than 183 days, then you have to apply, I guess, the other steps, that's sort of the factor test, those sort of things. Ultimately, when you look at on the surface of what the proposal was trying to do, especially if you've been a long-term tax resident in Australia and then you're heading overseas, it's trying to make our system more adhesive and sticky to your situation. So it was a lot harder for you just to say, "No, I'm a non-resident." So they do want to make it harder for you to declare yourself as a non-resident. That's clear. But probably the biggest concern, and probably mainly what I want to focus on today's call, is accidentally commencing residency or commencing residency. And the reason for that is I see that applying more to a lot of expats and I guess clients in general. I feel like it's going to, if these new rules are put forward in their current framework, I'm really fearful for a lot of clients because I feel like it's making them quite vulnerable because I know clients that come back to Australia, they come back over 45 days in an Australian financial year. They're only here catching up with friends and family. They're not here permanently, but I know so many that are just going to obviously go over the 45-day count as part of the proposal and accidentally trigger residency, and they'll meet the other factors as well comfortably. So that's mainly what I want to focus on today, Brett. And then I want to deep dive a little bit into what they're actually saying in those questions, because as part of the consultation process, and as part of all the different areas, as part of this proposal, they've actually put 2 to 3 questions per section, and they're throwing that out to us, the public, for people to provide commentary, experts, specialists, everyone to, send it all in so they can gather that information, that data, and go, cool, we need to make some amendments. Actually, no, it's fine in its current framework. So I guess let's focus on commencing tax residency, because I think that's probably going to be the main one. First and foremost, whether we're accidentally commencing tax residency, they're using this 45-day count. And again, this is in one financial year. It's not consecutively, and that's an important takeaway. So you could technically double up a little bit there, 45-day years, one financial year, and layer it over to another 45 days in the next financial year. And that's actually going to be okay. We released a really good flow chart, and probably best way to access it, and we'll put some articles or links to our old articles. Yeah, great. So that's what I'm most concerned about. If we spent more than 45 days in Australia, okay, yep, that's the first box we've ticked. It goes into the 4 factors. And the 4 factors are really simple and basic, and I'll read them out as it says on the actual flow chart. Right to reside permanently in Australia, factor 1. That's a permanent resident or an Australian citizen. So most Australian expats, that'll cover. The next factor, do we maintain Australian accommodation? Now, in the proposal, and I suppose the readings off the back of Australian accommodation, they were getting quite creative. Having a timeshare was technically going to be a form of Australian accommodation. This is going to apply to any expat that maintains a residence back in Australia but doesn't rent it out. That's going to be a big no-no when you apply these factor tests. Essentially, if we have a main residence that's now an investment property being rented out, that's okay. But I would say that it's going to be flip a coin or hit and miss. Some expats do maintain accommodation, some don't. Coming back and staying with a friend or relative, that's not Australian accommodation. So just bear that in mind. Australian family. So Australian family was an interesting one. Straight away, think about dependents. If you've got kids that you've sent back to Australia to attend school and they're boarding, or they're staying with friends and family, especially under the age of 18, they're going to be those direct, I suppose, ties back to Australia. A wife or a partner or a spouse, absolutely. That's a form of Australian family. And that's going to be that sort of tether back to Australia and that connection. So if that's, and you're falling into that camp, you'll be ticking that box. The last one is Australian economic interests. So this was an interesting one, but on the surface, if you own and hold taxable Australian property. So what is taxable Australian property? I think Brett and I harp on a lot about it with our clients, but it's anything physical, bricks and mortar, things that we own, such as an investment property that we're renting out, our former main residence that we're renting out. That is taxable Australian property, absolutely. Yep, block of land, anything physical like that, absolutely. And then even having ties to, say, a family trust, a discretionary trust. If you're, say, a trustee, I don't know how you're maintaining your trustee because you're a non-resident, but you've probably gotten quite creative there, a bit of rubber stamping. We won't get into that today. But having ties to an Australian family trust, under economic interests, there was even rumours of an Australian super fund. If you've got an Australian super fund account, you've got an Australian economic interest, and therefore most Australian expats will comfortably satisfy at least 2 factors. And that's actually all you need to do. If you satisfy 2 factors and you've been in Australia in one financial year for more than 45 days, your residency has recommenced, and it has recommenced as of the day that you landed in Australia, not the day after that 45-day period. And that's essentially what's going to capture, I think, a lot of expats out, because you might have an expat getting, not creative, but just forgetting about that day count. Maybe they fly into Australia September. They're here in Australia for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they return and come back in March. And in March, they accidentally go over that 45-day period for the full Australian financial year. The issue that creates is you actually commence your Australian financial or Australian tax residency back in September/August when you actually arrived. So that's the issue. And that's when you could have, say, maybe that tax-free wage income consumed by our very aggressive Australian tax rates. So it's something to be mindful of. But yes, the caveat there is 45 days plus satisfying at least 2 factors, which is essentially a bit of a catch-all, and then you've re-triggered your Australian tax residency. And I only wanted to harp on about those because that's what I'm more concerned about.
One more thing for the economic assets, cash, large cash balances. They've been very obtuse with respect to, or opaque with respect to what that comprises of. Yeah, $10, 50 grand, $1 million, don't know yet. Our guess, it's going to be 250 based on similar pieces of legislation that pertain to other, areas of financial products. So, watch that space. I think the important thing there's pros and cons with this legislation. The pro is if you spend less than 45 days in Australia, you can own half of Australia and you are guaranteed a non-resident for tax purposes. So that's the good thing. At the moment, it's very ethereal and very behaviour-based and, not black and white. So there are positives from the new legislation. But as you say, 45 days, even the Board of Taxation, they say if you're on a plane about to depart and the plane breaks down and you breach that 45, you're gone. So the good thing about the super legislation, the Board of Taxation did say that because super is immovable, you can't take it with you overseas. Therefore, they can't penalise people for not taking it because they can't take it. So we'll see what happens there, whether they include it and then change legislation in the SIS Act and to say, if you're a non-res, you can take your super. Who knows? I mean, there's going to be a lot of water to go under this bridge, just thinking out loud. But to me, obviously, just coming back to the petition we lodged, because that will then dovetail into the consultation paper, we argued for a couple of things. First one is 90 days, not 45. The big thing for us is 45 days in Australia to us does not imply enduring ties to Australia, which is what they're always pushing about. Tourists come to Australia for longer periods, so they're not Australian. So we need to build that scope out. And then the Board of Taxation actually does refer to that. It says we need to make sure we're not capturing tourists instead of people who technically could be tax residents. So pushing for 90 days was number one. Number two, returning there needs to be a number of exemptions in there pertaining to the day count. So returning to Australia to visit sick family members, returning to Australia for work, returning to Australia during times of war or pandemic. There should be documented exclusions for those sort of things, because if you're going to Australia because you work for an Australian company overseas, it still doesn't mean you're an Australian tax resident. You're going to need to work. So if your company needs to go back for a board meeting or whatever meeting, or you're an engineer and you need to work on some gear, that should not count as part of your day count, nor should you be penalised by spending less time with family because of that situation. Next one for us was certainly the family factor test. No exclusion for children at boarding school. A lot of expats use boarding school. So just because your kid's getting educated in Australia doesn't mean you have enduring ties to Australia. You could send your kid to UK, Australia, United States for education. You just happen to choose Australia because it's good education and you want them to have an Australian education. So a lot of Chinese students do that. They move to Australia to get a university degree. So it doesn't mean you're an Australian tax resident if you choose to send your kids back there. The last one we pushed on as well too, and I think this is probably one of the most important areas, was the fact that there needs to be a better scoring system. So when you look at these family factor tests, having an Australian passport should not rank as highly as, say, having family in Australia. They shouldn't work on. So it might be half a point for a passport and 1 point for a family in Australia. And the reason I say that is these days people have double and triple and quad passports around the world.
They do.
So the passport inclusion, it to me isn't as important as they probably think it is. And then other things too, like owning property. I think the accommodation one, if you have a house in Australia untenanted, should rank higher than if you own property in general under the economic assets test. So anyway, this is what we're going to be pushing on, or what we pushed on with respect to the petition. The good thing is with the consultation paper, I think with the petition we can only use 600 words in that petition. So it's very difficult. Right. Now we can give them 60 pages, which is good.
That's right.
So, mate, let's run through the consultation paper and that process and then what they're asking, and then we can go from there.
Well, I mean, high-level summary of opening up for consultation. One thing that I found really interesting about reading the actual consultation paper is when you go back and look at the very long Board of Taxation report, it had information in there relating to where they've sort of pulled, as an example, the 45-day factor test from. And what it's doing in the consultation paper is it's actually just condensing all these paragraphs specific to these new tests and trying to give you a bit of background of where they've just pulled this random figure from. So the 45-day test, that, what they've said is, well, this is longer than most people have for annual leave per year. So people shouldn't be going over that. If they are, then it could be, a case where they're coming back permanently, as an example. That, that's high level. But I found that really interesting, where they're actually providing some little summaries as to where they've pulled this kind of data and information from. They even refer to the 45-day count that they've selected. They refer to migration data back in 2018. So obviously that's a little bit outdated now. But that's what I enjoyed about reading it, having a firm understanding of trying to come from where the government's thinking and the data that's supporting it and these decisions. And funny enough, they even say, the reason why we're introducing this isn't a form of tax revenue raising. It's just to update it. They try and say that. And I thought that was quite interesting, which, I feel like everything that they update is always a form of tax revenue raising, to be honest.
They're not a charity.
No, that's exactly right. Not without tax rates. Holy shit. But that was some really good information that I took away from it, especially the overseas employment rule. They provide some really good insights into how they come about selecting that. And to give you a bit of an example of that, this is more so about ceasing residency in the future. People that are wanting to retire overseas, if they're not satisfied in this overseas employment rule, flat out, they're not going to be able to just cut ties with Australia. It's actually going to take several years. That's not the biggest end to the world, to be honest, because they might be able to benefit from some concessions on the Australian side. So,
50% CGT on property and all that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's what they talk about as well. They say, expats right now are at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing the main residence exemption and the 50% CGT discount concession. So they actually mentioned that in pretty much, I think it was the first 3 pages, which I thought was really, really interesting. In terms of the very long list of questions, probably the best source is going back to the appendix at the end.
Yep.
So they've got about a 2-page list of questions. It's just over a page, sorry, but it's applying to each of the sections. So I'm going to read out just a quick example. So let's look at commencing residency. Does having 3 points of connection, i.e. physical presence in Australia for more than 45 days in an income year, together with 2 factors, strike the right level of connection to commencing residency? So that's exactly what Brett just talked about sort of fleshing out, I suppose the underlying reasons for that. 45 days is probably enough. It should be up, a little bit more than that. And then if you're stuck in Australia for specific reasons, or you're back in Australia for specific reasons, there should be carve-outs for that. And I mean, the way that they could really have that carved out is, there could be just a simple application, a 3 or 4 page application that gets submitted with your non-resident tax return in that financial year that you're back for more than, say, 60 or 90 days, and it just gets filed to the ATO as a declaration. That's it. That's a way that you could carve it out. That's a simple operation. It's something that your accountant handles. It's not something that, falls onto you to work out how to complete. It's just an additional step in completing your NR return, depending on, your other assets back in Australia. That's a really good example. But yeah, I would highly recommend that our listeners go back and have a bit of a refresh and read through this consultation paper, or opening up for consultation, I should say. Read through the checklist questions, because it tries to give you a bit of insight into what they're thinking as well, and then that they're not completely oblivious to the issues that the modernising rules actually raise. So I thought that was a really good takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing for us is this is one of the few chances we get in our lifetime to give coalface feedback to Canberra, whether they listen or not, that's by the by. But given the fact that it's been almost 90 years since we last did it, it may not be another 50 years. So it's important we get this right. It's important we really educate them on these issues. We saw when they tried to apply the main residence exemption changes in that first bill back in 2017, ourselves and some other industry partners, got very vocal on it. We're able to stop the first bill, highlight the inadequacies of that bill. Unfortunately, they came back with a second iteration bill, which was a band-aided solution. For us, that was anyway, it showed that you can stymie that scenario. I think the biggest thing for us is it's the context. I mean, these guys live in Canberra. So they'd have no idea of a working lifestyle of someone in Dubai or London, Singapore, New York. We live a very, very different life to that of an Australian tax resident. So, we'll be giving this a good nudge to really just point, because as you pointed out, 2 points of connection depends. If you've got an Australian passport, no. People, my wife has a British passport. Hasn't been to Britain in many, many years. So it doesn't mean she's a tax resident of Britain. So I think there needs to be that scoring system. I think there needs to be some sort of application of common sense with respect to if, and I'm going back to my old law subject days, university, so it's a long time ago now, back in pre-2000s, wow. And our law lecturer always used to talk about the man on the Putnam bus, I think it was. If you're a lawyer out there, you might be able to correct me if I'm right or wrong. And it was always, that was the general person's view. The man on the Putnam bus, what would he say with respect to, these rules or regulations? What would his view be? And that's what we need to give. We need to give them, the expat version, the man on the Putnam bus's approach to saying, look, if you did this, there's that issue. If you did this, that's that issue. So, it's nice that we have a chance to have a say, which is good. But whether they listen or not, that's going to be the question.
Well, that's it. And again, a big reminder for our listeners is that it is probably the biggest piece of legislation which will impact Australian expats probably in our lifetime. So it's important to get quite noisy. Share an opinion as well. On the consultation paper, there's an email in there that you can share an opinion. Do it. They want to hear feedback from everyone. If you know that in its current form, the residency rules don't align with, I suppose, modern day in life, especially the 45 days, provide your commentary. This is what they want to hear. This is the only opportunity we have before they legislate it and, they don't reopen it. Look at the main residence exemption talked about in 2017. The acts came down December 2019, legislated in place 30th of June 2020. And that's it. They're not going to go back and have a look at that now. That's done. And it's much like the CGT discount concession being removed back in May 2012. So they won't revisit this again in our lifetime. So it's important that you are quite vocal. When we talk about the process, so when they open something up for consultation, like they are right now, it looks like we have up until towards the end of September to provide that consultation, submit all our different proposals and recommendations. After that, Brett, next steps as part of that process.
So then they take all the submissions that everyone's submitted and go through and review them from an applicability point of view, whether they're relevant or not. That will then form the basis of the government's opinion when building the legislation. So they'll go and build the legislation, develop the explanatory memorandum, which explains the legislation. The big question mark for us, how long is that period going to take? Do they have the raw bones of that legislation built now? And then based on the consultation period, then it's tweaking it. In that case, they could turn this thing around pretty quickly. Given the fact that ScoMo, pretty much got quite advanced on this before they got kicked out, to me says that Treasury's got something there. They're not working from scratch. So it won't take them as long as, say, something that's brand new from a concept point of view. It is a how long is a piece of string question, which is, the email that we sent out to all our followers and clients this week. We come back saying, when's it going to come in? When's it going to come in? We don't know. If they turn this around quickly in government speak, they might actually have a piece of legislation to present in a couple of months after the consultation period, which is 22nd September, so 51 days from today. The big question is going to be is the natural course of Parliament. So once they present a piece of legislation, it has to go through the scrutineers committee to make sure it is appropriate, and then it gets put on the House floor for debate and voting. Parliament's last day is sitting this calendar year is the 30th of November. So I think there's a pretty slim chance that, it'll be presented to the House of Reps. But I do think, I don't know, something tells me that this is more advanced than we're taking it, than we're seeing it. So to me, I think there's a very good chance we might see the EM, the legislation, before Christmas, but then Parliament doesn't resit until February 2024. So that's the first chance that we see members voting on the bill. How long that takes, we've seen bills get tied up before because of objections and all sorts of stuff. So if we look at, say, the main resident exemption, how quick they got that through, there is a slim chance that this thing could be through, voted on and receive royal assent before 30 June next year. Slim chance.
I reckon slim. Slim. They'll sit on it. Because we've got to remember, they've already opened this up for consultation before, and now it's come back around again. So,
and the other thing too is, sorry, keep going.
You go, bro.
I'll
Oh
just
no,
say
all I was going to say was remember this process started back in 2017, 2016 even. So
mm,
it's like they've just been kicking the can down the road constantly. We're getting closer though. I will admit we are getting closer. I still don't reckon it'll be legislated next year. I think it's a 2024 sort of mid 2025 sort of scenario that might play out.
the big question to me is in the Board of Taxation's recommendations, they did discuss a implementation period of 12 to 24 months. So whether Canberra takes their liberties to say that, well, no, ScoMo mentioned this back in 2021. You guys have had 2 years to pontificate and get used to the idea. That's your consultation period. That's your review period. Or whether they say, okay, legislation passes on the 1st of July 2024, but then it won't be enacted until 2025. I don't know. This thing could go in a number of different ways. You know, if you could see behind the scenes, it'd make our job a lot easier to know how advanced they are with this thing. If this is more of a rubber stamping exercise, they've pretty much got it built, they can get this thing through pretty quickly. It depends on how high it is on their priority list from a policy point of view.
Yeah, and I guess if it goes through in its current form, the government will pass it over to the ATO to sort of work out specific controls, so they can identify people that are worth auditing to see whether they've, ticked over, if they have ticked over the 45-day rules. So it'd be very interesting to learn more about those kind of specific controls that they look to implement as part of sort of maybe doing a tax return. I know right now when you do your tax return, there is a section on residency where it says day that you returned or the day that you left, and it obviously impacts a lot of the rates in the background on your tax rates, your marginal tax rates. But very interesting to see the kind of controls that they implement, whether there's something separate to tax residency now as part of your usual tax return. And, there's a page where you got to complete a 5 to 10 page sort of checklist, and that identifies whether you're worth looking into further.
100%. 100%. And that's the thing to me is it is a bit of a how long's a piece of string. Probably the most popular question is, do we have to worry about it in this financial year, 2023-24? No, they're not going to make this retrospective. There's no way that you can suddenly go back and undo the days you did based on your beliefs of a residency system dating back to 1936.
Yeah,
so
that's right. It can't be retrospective like that. Absolutely not.
Exactly. So yeah, for this year we're safe. Next year, don't know. But we will know more in the coming months. I think this thing is going to gather momentum, gather a bit of pace. And from that scenario, we're going to go through a period of a lot of digesting of a lot of information. When these pieces of legislation come out, they're big. And this is such a pivotal piece of legislation. There's a reason why they haven't updated it for so long, because it's not something to be mucked around with. So to me, it's going to be, we'll know more as we get through that process. But worst case scenario comes in 1 July 2024. Best case scenario comes in 25 or 26.
Yep, that's right. Mate, I think that's a really good stage to leave it there. We'll put some really insightful links linking to a few articles that were published in the past, as well as this, I suppose, this recent report that they released as part of opening up for submission. If you do have time, I highly recommend providing your own feedback and sending into that email address that's on that report. The more people that send in, information and feedback, even if you're almost control copying what we want to propose, that's great. It gets more traction. It has legs. They take it under consideration. If no one comments or provides anything on this, well, they're just going to go forward, as it is in its current form, which is a bit disastrous, to be honest. So this is our chance to get something a bit more specific to how expats move around the world.
Exactly. If you don't submit something and it goes through, don't whinge, because you had your chance. And as you say, to me, it's very much about the global say as opposed to what we say. If we're saying it and 30 other people are saying the same thing, they'll go, oh, okay, no, this might actually have a relevant point here. So so folks, all the information will be in the links down below. Thanks for your time. Bit of care and maintenance. Big thing for us, rating reviews, guys. It obviously helps us have that conversation, especially when we're talking about pivotal topics like today. We want all expats to be aware of these changes coming through. So just give us a thumbs up if you're on YouTube, or a rating review on the podcast channels. Mate, thanks very much for today. Thank you for the welcome back. It's nice to be back in the hot seat, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Yeah, you like that? We'll see.
See you guys.
Thanks, mate. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks, guys. See you.
Bye.